My name is Eric Gaskell, and you're listening to the Distorted History Podcast.
To speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
I can give you merry tales and joyous laughter.
Shameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
A long struggle for freedom.
It really is a revolution.
The names Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid conjure up images of horses, cowboys, wide-open western vistas, bandits, outlaws, and daring heists. The names have been paired together for well over a century and have been portrayed numerous times over the years, most famously in the 1969 film Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. More recently, from what I understand, as I have not actually read the tome myself, in the book Red Dead's History, Professor Tor Olson suggests that the Vanderlyn gang of Red Dead Redemption 2 were likely inspired by the infamous Wild Bunch, who were more or less led by Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. A comparison that even without reading that specific book, from what I have read concerning the true story of these outlaw figures, does make sense. Having fairly recently replayed said game, I will speak more on that comparison and about the general myth-making around Butch and Sundance and around outlaws in general in later episodes. I might, even before I'm done writing these episodes, try to sit down and watch the aforementioned movie, which is a bit easier said than done, as I've not been great at watching movies in recent years, as for some reason, I feel like I have to sit down and watch the entire thing from beginning to end in one sitting with no interruptions. A commitment I don't often feel comfortable in making, even though I may consume something of similar length instead, but because it's broken up into smaller pieces it feels less daunting. Regardless of my own initial quirks, none of that is the focus of this particular episode. Instead, I intend to focus specifically on Butch and Sundance's early lives and the fairly similar paths that took them to initially becoming outlaws. First, however, like always, I want to acknowledge my sources for this series, which include Tom Hatch's The Last Outlaws, The Lives and Legends of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Paul Kuistra's Criminals as Heroes, Structure, Power, and Identity, Richard Patterson's Butch Cassidy, a biography, Donna B. Ernst's The Sundance Kid, The Life of Harry Alonzo Longaball, and Charles Kelly's The Outlaw Trail, A History of Butch Cassidy and His Wild Bunch. And like always, these and any additional sources like websites that I used will be listed on this podcast Twitter and Ko-fi pages, links to which are in the description. And with all that being said, let's begin. The infamous Butch Cassidy was not actually born Butch Cassidy. Instead, his family name wasn't even Cassidy at all. Instead, the future outlaw was born Robert Leroy Parker on the 13th of April 1866 in Beaver, Utah. Robert, the future Butch Cassidy, or Bob as he was most often called, and I will typically refer to him for the time being, was then born a year after the Civil War ended, meaning he would grow up in a nation very much still reeling from that bloody conflict. Also telling was the fact that the future outlaw was born in Utah, a land settled by the Mormons who admittedly had largely stayed out of said Civil War. The Parkers then, as you might expect, were Mormons. A bit more surprising, however, is the fact that the Parkers were actually fairly recent immigrants from Lancashire, England, where just 30 years earlier, Butch/Bob's grandfather and namesake Robert first heard about Mormonism as a group of missionaries came to town looking to spread the message of their new religion. A message that the elder Robert Parker, an expert weaver at the local textile mill, fully bought into. Now, the elder Robert was not alone in this, as there were a number of other working-class Europeans from around that time who were likely disillusioned with traditional religious doctrine and were thus eager to embrace this new group, who were claiming to be returning to the original true message of Christianity. Mormonism essentially offered the excitement of a new religion while still being cloaked in some of the old familiar Christianity they were already used to, just with some new stories, new saints, and new prophets, making it feel more alive and vibrant in comparison. The elder Robert then raised his and his wife and 6 children in this new controversial faith. That being said, one of his children in particular did not seem to be quite as on board with Mormonism as his father and likely at least some of his siblings. Namely, Maximilian, or Maxie as he was known, the eldest of the children and the eventual father of young Robert/Butch, was seemingly not quite as into this new faith as some of the others were. Regardless, back in America, the Mormons were making their home in Utah, after not being what you would call welcomed elsewhere. Life there, especially in those early days, was not easy. However, their community would be saved in no small part due to the California gold rush, which allowed the Mormons to sell supplies at inflated rates to the hopeful prospectors who were suddenly passing through their lands. With the initial settlements now established, other Mormons were then called to join them. Specifically, in 1856, Brigham Young put out a call for the skilled tradesmen in Europe who had converted to immigrate to America and then make their way to the so-called Mormon Promised Land, which is why the Parker family chose to leave England behind, as the elder Robert and his wife Anne sold much of their belongings, including their home, their cow, and their furniture, as they prepared to board a ship bound for Boston with their children on the 22nd of March, 1856, all in response to Brigham Young's call. From Boston, the Parker clan traveled to Iowa City, where they joined up with the other Mormons who, like them, were heading west to Utah, doing so by hauling all their remaining belongings and supply in handcarts across the untamed West, with the idea of using handcarts rather than the more stereotypical covered wagons being a decision made by Brigham Young, with the understanding that most of these latest immigrants were skilled tradesmen and likely had no experience handling livestock. Indeed, as a result of Young's very specific call for European artisans, this was an extremely unprepared group of people for the trials that awaited them. These, after all, were people used to living in the cities and mill towns of Europe, people who thus never had any reason to do the kinds of things they very much would now be expected to do, like sleep in tents or cook over campfires. So, rather than trying to teach these former residents of European cities how to handle the teams of horses or oxen that would be required to pull wagons across the West, he instead ordered them to use handcarts, which in and of itself would be its own hassle that these new immigrants had to deal with, as they had, among everything else, never had to travel over long distances without any kind of roads, much less having to do so while hauling all their belongings along behind them in a handcart. In all, this journey would take some 3.5 months, with the Parker family eventually settling in Beaver, where the elder Robert had been sent to help establish a woolen mill. Meanwhile, as the skilled weaver was undertaking this task, his 18-year-old son Maximilian, who never found life working in a textile mill to be a good fit, took up other work like helping to guide new immigrants from St. Louis to Utah. Eventually, Max would marry one Annie Gillis and start working as a mail carrier, which was a much more dangerous job back then, as you traveled from settlement to settlement through the kinds of lands that may be occupied by Native Americans like the Utes, who were not exactly fans of these newcomers who were invading their traditional hunting grounds and gathering places. Dangerous as this work was, Max would survive, and he and Annie would have 13 children together, with their firstborn being none other than our future Butch Cassidy, Robert Leroy Parker, who was named after his grandfather. Max would eventually settle his growing family on 160 acres of land in a rather beautiful, albeit parched area known as Circle Valley, land that he first beheld and fell in love with during his days as a mail carrier as he passed through this region on his rides in between settlements. Beautiful as it was, starting a farm out here was no easy task. Indeed, Max, with young Bob's help, had to plant their first crop of wheat 3 times before it finally took root and started to grow, as strong winds had literally torn the seeds out of the ground not once but twice. Then, once the crop was successfully planted, Max left home to take a job cutting and hauling wood for the Silver Reef mine, a job that kept him away from home much of the time. Now, while this situation kept him away from his family, it likely wasn't all bad, as Max wasn't exactly the most devout Mormon. Indeed, the eventual Butch Cassidy's father was what was known as a quote-unquote Jack Mormon, meaning he wasn't an active church-going member of the community. Max was even known to smoke, which is very much against the Mormon tenets. Facts which Max suspected were very much used against him when he had a land dispute with a fellow Mormon. A dispute which by the laws/traditions of Utah at the time was placed in the hands of a Mormon bishop to judge. A dispute in which the bishop ultimately decided against the interests of the Parkers, a decision that Max attributed to being the result of his less than stellar attendance record at church, an outcome that only served to sour him more against the Mormon leadership, which he likely didn't have a high opinion of already. You see, Max had long had a bit of a rebellious streak, especially where his father, the original Robert Parker, was concerned. Where his father was an expert and well-respected weaver at the mill back in Lancashire, Max had rejected that life, and even at one point refused to go back to work in the mill regardless of what punishments his father doled out. It then doesn't feel like a stretch to think that this same vein of rebelliousness against his father might also explain his at least partial rejection of Mormonism. The fact that his father was so extremely devout to the point that he even made his eldest son Max polish the shoes of the Mormon missionaries who came to visit back in England may have bred a resentment in the young man. Maxon, even when he was home, rarely attended church, and he also did not obey the Mormon tradition of it being the father's responsibility to lead his family's prayers and share the church's teachings with them, leaving such responsibilities to his wife instead. Now, young Bob, our future Butch Cassidy, would learn how to read and write thanks to his mother's instructions, but when it came to religion, he took more after his father, as, according to his sister, quote, Bob wasn't a willing attender. If he could find some chore, any chore that needed his attention, he stayed home to take care of it. Any excuse was convenient. Meanwhile, with Max often away taking other jobs to support the family, the work around the farm was left to the by then 13-year-old Bob Parker, which he was kind of fine with, as he was said to have been especially good at handling the livestock, as he seemed to have a special affinity and understanding of animals for as long as anyone could remember. Now, it wasn't all work, as young Bob was also known to play rodeo by riding calves, as well as holding chariot races by hooking up goats to homemade carts. He also raised and kept as pets any number of animals, including rabbits, chipmunks, pigeons, and a magpie over the years. The other children also reportedly loved young Bob, because he always seemed to have something fun going on. Like he was known to give the little kids horse rides, and do things like build a raft big enough for a number of the other children to ride on. He even reportedly held grasshopper races where all the kids would catch a grasshopper, to which Bob tied strings to their back legs for some reason. As Bob grew older, the animals that he took care of got bigger as well, as he started working with full-grown horses. In doing so, it said he learned everything about them, from grooming to training and even doctoring them. Indeed, it said that young Bob had a special relationship with horses. In particular, he had a reputation for easily breaking and training any horse, no matter how wild or untamable they seemed to be to anyone else. Even horses that would not allow anyone to come near them were said to have allowed Bob to get close, as he had a knack for knowing exactly how to move and speak to these animals to get them to trust him. Soon enough, this reputation would see young Bob hired out to neighboring ranches to work as a cowboy for them. In doing so, Bob, our future Butch Cassidy, helped to add to his family's finances, something that was sorely needed after a particularly bad winter had claimed the lives of all but 2 of the cows on the family's ranch. This turn of events as well led Bob to taking a job at a ranch a bit more farther afield than he usually would. Far enough away, in fact, that Bob actually lived on the ranch in question rather than at home, putting him outside his mother's influence for the first time in his life, a situation which, somewhat tellingly, resulted in his first crime, of a sort. You see, Bob rode out from the ranch one day to the nearest town intending to buy a new pair of overalls that he apparently desperately needed. However, upon arriving in town, he found that the general store was closed. This was a frustrating situation. He had essentially wasted his time riding into town when there was surely work he could have been doing and getting paid for back on the ranch. Plus, remember, it's not like he had simply hopped into a car and drove there. Instead, he had ridden on horseback down a long and dusty trail. Yet before Bob turned around and departed for the ranch empty-handed, our young future outlaw had an idea for how he could salvage this trip. Namely, he broke into the store in question, at which point, upon finding an appropriate pair of overalls, he took them while making sure to leave the store owner a note with his name and a promise to return and settle his bill. The store owner in question, however, apparently had a bit of a problem with having a store broken into. So, upon finding Bob's note, he took it straight to the town marshal. Young Bob Parker was then taken into custody for the first time in his life. Now, the matter would eventually be settled, but Bob had been thoroughly humiliated by his community for this offense. It was then a welcome change when Anne, Bob's mother, was able to get her son a job at the Marshall Ranch, which kept him closer to home. In fact, as it turns out, she herself also worked on the Marshall Ranch running their dairy, pay from which further kept the family afloat, while also ensuring her growing children had consistent access to fresh dairy products. The main drawback to this job, though, was required Anne to make an 8-mile ride in between her family's ranch and the Marshalls early every morning. So to try and take some of the burden off of her shoulders, it was agreed that she and her 3 sons could move into a small house on the ranch during the summer months, while her daughter stayed back on the family homestead, maintaining the home for their father. Now, while Anne likely thought this an excellent arrangement for putting her eldest boy back on the straight and narrow, this job on the Marshall Ranch ultimately only served to push young Bob closer to his eventual outlaw destiny. You see, also working on the ranch alongside young Bob Parker was a newly hired hand who went by the name of Mike Cassidy, whose name alone hints at his importance to this story. What Jim Marshall, the owner of the ranch, did not know was that while he was away on other business, his newly hired hand Mike Cassidy was introducing a number of the other cowboys working the ranch and the finer points of cattle rustling. Now, cattle rustling is a concept that has largely faded into history, but it was largely the byproduct of so-called cattle barons taking advantage of the railroads and the open ranges of the West. Basically, these wealthy individuals or business concerns would ship enormous herds of cattle in on the trains and just kind of let them loose on the open public lands of the Western territories. This led to disputes between the cattle barons and the small homesteaders who also wanted to use those same lands for their own animals and did not appreciate the cattle barons and their massive herds consuming all their resources. As a result of this situation, more than a few individuals in the West did not think too much of taking advantage of said cattle barons as they laid claim to a few of their numerous cows for themselves. You see, with such massive herds, invariably a few young recently born calves would regularly slip through the branding process. Thus, any who wandered away from their mothers in such an unmarked state were in the eyes of the homesteaders more or less free to be claimed and branded by whoever found them. Now, most folk limited themselves to claiming these so-called mavericks, as there was really no way to prove where they had come from. That being said, some more criminally minded individuals created brands that obscured or hid the original brand enough to disguise it, so the livestock could then be sold to some unsuspecting or unscrupulous buyer. Alternatively, some rustlers might simply kill and butcher the cattle right in the field, enabling them to sell just the beef without having to worry about the brand. All of which was possible due to the simple fact that the cattle barons' herds were so enormous they could not or simply would not hire enough cowboys to watch all of them. I mean, the whole purpose of setting the cattle loose on the range in the first place was to limit costs, as it would be left to fend for themselves on public land. As such, the cattle barons weren't about to turn around and invest a ton of money into an army of cowboys to watch over their herds. Now, to be clear, cattle rustling was technically a crime that was punishable by death. The thing was, as I already alluded to, it wasn't always so easy to prove where a cow had come from initially, much less who owned them when they were just kind of let loose on the plains. For Mike Cassidy in particular, this was something he had been doing for some time. He had reportedly been a drifter since an early age, and he had supported himself for much of that time by rustling cattle, an activity he would not stop doing just because he had a job on the Marshall Ranch. Instead, he would, with the help of some of his fellow ranch hands, actually bring cattle of questionable origin back to the ranch while Jim Marshall was away to brand them for sale. Notably, the ranch hand that Mike Cassidy likely influenced the most during his time on the Marshall Ranch was none other than young Bob Parker, who looked up to the man who was several years his senior. The two would strike up a friendship, in which, among other things, Mike would share with the younger Bob tales from the very much un-Mormon cattle towns he typically frequented. These were places with saloons, gambling dens, and dancing girls. In other words, a world that young Bob Parker had absolutely no frame of reference for, having lived his entire life within Mormon-held lands, where saloons, brothels, and the like were explicitly forbidden. It was then through Mike Cassidy's stories that Bob's mind was exposed to a whole new world. Not only that, but it was also through Mike that Bob got his first six-shooter and was taught how to use it. Now, Bob's mother, Ann, was aware of her son's fascination with the older ranch hand, and while she likely had no clue about his cattle rustling activities, she still had the sense that this was not the sort of man she wanted her boy consorting with. Yet at the same time, she knew she couldn't exactly lecture Bob or outright forbid him from hanging around with the other man. He was too old for that at this point, and would likely only further enhance his fascination with the older cowboy. Instead, perhaps hoping that putting some distance between the two would help, and in the spring of 1884 would move back to the family's own homestead, with the hope being that her now 18-year-old son would follow and take up more responsibilities on the family ranch that could certainly use some of the various skills he had picked up over the years, especially since his father Max oftentimes was still away from home working other jobs to provide for the family. Things, however, would not work out the way that Anne wanted, as by June of that year, Bob would inform her that he planned to leave not just the ranch, but possibly Utah entirely. Her son simply could not see a future for himself there, what with paying the territory in general just being poor. Plus, there was really just nothing exciting going on in the territory, especially for a young 18-year-old man like himself. The way Bob saw it, if he wanted to make something of himself, he had to go elsewhere. To that end, Bob Parker, the future Butch Cassidy, was planning on making his way to Colorado to see what he could find there, with his initial plan being looking for work in a mine in Telluride, all of which was quite a shock to his mother. But what really took her by surprise was his pronouncement that he was intending to leave the very next morning, and begged her son to wait just a few days for his father to return, so at the very least he could say his goodbyes to him as well. Bob, however, would not be swayed. He would be leaving the next morning, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. The lone relief his mother had then was, at the very least, her son wasn't riding off with that Mike Cassidy. As rumor had it, he had potentially headed off down to Mexico by this point in time. Which then begs the question, if Bob Parker wasn't running off to work with his mentor Mike Cassidy, why then was he in such a hurry to leave? Now, we don't really know the answer, but there are various explanations of why the future Butch Cassidy was in such a rush. The simplest being he just didn't like long goodbyes, or there's also the possibility that he had made up his mind to leave and did not want to be talked out of it, so it was best to just go as soon as possible. Then there's some more juicy speculation, like Bob had stolen some horses from one of the Parker's neighbors, Jim Kettleman, a claim that Bob's sister disputes, as her brother throughout his life was extremely loyal to friends and family, and her brother had long considered Kettleman to be his personal friend. So while her brother's departure happened around the same time as a theft, she contended that was just a coincidence, as Bob would never steal from someone he considered to be his friend. Bob's father, meanwhile, on his way back to the family ranch, supposedly came across some gossip that may have explained his son's hasty departure. Apparently, two of Bob's friends, a Charlie and a Fred, had been caught with some cattle that did not belong to them. In an attempt to avoid being punished for this apparent theft, the two men supposedly produced a paper that had been signed by Bob Parker that claimed he had sold them the cattle in question, with the implication being Fred and Charlie had not known that the cattle had been stolen. As such, the blame was then shifted onto Bob. Now, when Max investigated this for himself, the constable who had handled the case seemingly implied that what really happened was Bob had agreed to take the metaphorical fall for his friends. You see, Fred and Charlie were Mormons of good standing with families of their own. As such, it would be hard on them to be saddled with the shame and controversy of being caught with stolen cattle. For Bob, though, he had no family of his own, and like his father, he was not exactly in great standing with the church. So, untied down as he was, it wasn't seen as a big deal for Bob to accept the blame and then disappear from the territory for a while. Yet another version of events meanwhile suggests that Bob had hooked up with an infamous cattle rustler named Cap Brown, who operated out of a parched and desolate region in eastern Utah known as Robber's Roost, an inhospitable region almost designed to be used by outlaws, what with its easily defended steep-walled canyons that were chock full of hiding places. Working out of Robber's Roost, Cap Brown was known to recruit local cowboys to aid in his rustling operations. Basically, he would hire 3 to 4 young men who were looking to make some money to rustle up stray horses from the various ranches in the region to be taken to Colorado to sell to the miners there. If Bob Parker, the future Butch Cassidy, was working for the infamous Cap Brown, he likely would have been introduced to the outlaw by none other than his mentor Mike Cassidy. In this version of events, then, the reason for Bob's quick departure was he had been hired by Cap Brown to help drive some 20 horses through Utah's Badlands to the mining community in Telluride, and he had to leave in such haste so as to meet with the others as scheduled. What truth there is in any of these possibilities we'll probably never know. Regardless, the man who would one day become Butch Cassidy had set off on his own to make his way in the world. Now, he wasn't quite fully on the path to becoming an outlaw at this point, but he had taken a few steps in that direction, and in Telluride, he would take some more. As you might expect, the Sundance Kid was not actually born with that name. Instead, long before he earned that famous moniker and was called the fastest gun in the West, he was born Harry Alonzo Longaball in 1867. Harry was the youngest of 5 children born to Josiah and Annie Longabaugh, and he grew up in a blue-collar community alongside the Schuylkill River in Pennsylvania, a bit of a ways to the north of Philadelphia. Now, where Butch Cassidy's family, the Parkers, were fairly recent arrivals to the United States, what with the family heeding Brigham Young's call to emigrate from England in 1856, the Longaboughs had been in the country since 1772, when Conrad Langenbach emigrated from Germany as an indentured servant. Conrad then finished his term as an indentured servant and was freed from his debt just in time to serve in the Revolutionary War, and was even rumored to have been in Valley Forge. The Longabaugh family was fairly respectable then. Indeed, Harry's uncle Michael owned a large home thanks to the fact that he ran and owned both a canal boat service and a small store. Michael used both businesses to make a tidy profit for himself, as he shipped goods from his store on his canal boats to places like Scranton, New York, and Boston. Harry's father Josiah, meanwhile, much like Bob Parker's father, was something of an oddball/black sheep of the family, as he never really had a regular steady job. Instead, he changed jobs constantly as he worked as a carpenter, a farmhand, a day laborer, and working the canal. He just could never seem to hold onto a job for long, and his family suffered as a result, often having to move from one rented home to another. In some ways, then, both Harry and Bob's father were somewhat similar, as they were outliers in their family who, throughout the time their sons were growing up, worked a series of jobs never really advancing or making all that much money in the process. Meanwhile, the future Sundance Kid's mother, Annie, much like Butch Cassidy's, was a religiously devout parent, which makes sense, given the fact that her father was a deacon and founding father of the local Baptist church, who also had prominent political connections, which only makes Josiah's lack of success that much more notable. Yet, regardless of her husband's and their family struggles, Annie always made sure her family was in attendance at the local Baptist church every Sunday. Meanwhile, as a result of their economic struggles, Harry, much like his future partner in crime from a fairly early age, took up work to help out. Young Harry and his brother, for example, for a time would work in their uncle's canal business, driving the mules who pulled the boats along their way, work which kept them out of school in the spring, summer, and fall months, meaning that young Harry's education was limited to what he could learn during the winter months. That being said, young Harry definitely learned how to read, as he had his own library card, and reading would seemingly become one of his favorite ways to pass the time, a hobby he also shared with his future partner in crime. What exactly the young boy read is unknown, although given his later career and the kinds of books that were popular at the time, especially among young boys, many assume that young Harry Longabaugh, the future Sundance Kid, often read tales of cowboys and adventures in the West, the kinds of pulp novels that glorified the lives of outlaws and men operating outside the strict bounds of the law. The work of being a mule driver for the canal required young Harry and any other young children employed in this task to be up at 3 every morning to care for the mules and get them ready to start work at 4 a.m. This included feeding, brushing, and harnessing them for the day's work. From there, Harry would walk with the mules along the length of the canal until the end of the day, when, before going to bed himself, he still had to care for the mules first by watering, feeding, and brushing them. Harry did this from a young age, as young as 6 until he turned 13, at which point, much like Bob Parker, the future Butch Cassidy, he was hired to work on a farm far enough away from his family's home that he only returned to see them on Sundays. Harry would work on the Wilmer Ralston family farm, which is where he first got his education handling and dealing with horses. It was here that he not only learned how to ride, but where he expanded the knowledge he already had for caring for mules to the ways to care for the various different types of livestock. This knowledge and skill for working with livestock, horses in particular, was another thing that Harry and his future partner in crime would share. However, while working on this farm, he would not have his first unintentional brush with the law, and nor would he leave home in the same kind of sudden, mysterious, and somewhat dramatic fashion. You see, where Bob Parker left home abruptly with little explanation as to why, thereby opening the door for speculation that he was avoiding the law or was otherwise involved in criminal behavior of some sort, Harry Longabaugh, the future Sundance Kid, on the 30th of August 1882 at just 14 years old, would leave home heading west. To be clear, though, he was not striking off on his own just yet. Instead, the still young Harry was heading for Colorado at the invitation of his distant cousin George. George, who along with his pregnant wife Mary and his young son Walter, had only just recently arrived in Cortez, Colorado. George and his family then very much needed help in building barns, raising crops, and breeding horses, all skills that young Harry had picked up while working at the Wilmer Ralston family farm. Harry Longabaugh would then stay with his cousin for 4 years until 1886, when the 18-year-old, much like his future partner in crime, set off on his own. Where he wanted to at this point exactly is unknown, although it's more than likely he made a living picking up work as a cowboy on the multitude of ranches in the region. Now, to be clear, the life of a cowboy was nothing like the adventurous and glamorous tales told in dime novels and the like. Cowboys didn't dress fancy or even have particularly unique attire. Instead, they wore ordinary work clothes, which consisted of loose cotton or flannel shirts that were paired with heavy-duty woolen pants until the 1890s, when Levi's blue jeans became more commonplace. Over the top of these pants for added protection, these cowboys typically wore leather chaps. Now their boots were a bit more unique, as they were typically custom-made and not mass-produced. These boots featured pointed toes to make them easier to slip into stirrups and thick heels to keep them in place. They also often had spurs attached, with which they would encourage their horses to speed up. Their hats, meanwhile, varied by region, but would typically feature a wide brim of some sort to shade the wearer's eyes from the sun and to keep the rain off their faces. As for the work these men did, their typical day lasted 14 hours if not longer, hours which were invariably filled with tough, sweaty, dirty, and dangerous work. Work that consisted of herding, branding, protecting, and even providing medical care for cattle who did not exactly care for the way they were being led about and treated. For example, they obviously did not understand that the medical or whatever care they were being given was good for them. Plus, they certainly took exception to the whole piece of red-hot metal being pressed into their hide bit. As such, they were not what you would call easy to deal with. Indeed, they were known to kick, gore, trample, and stomp unfortunate cowboys with a vengeance. Now, you would think that the long hours, not to mention the hard and dangerous nature of the work, would at the very least mean a good payday when all was said and done. That, however, was not the case. Instead, one of the few advantages that this life had was that the oftentimes young and single men involved in it were free to range about looking for better opportunities at different ranches. That is, if they even decided to keep on being cowboys, as it wasn't uncommon for first-timers to spend less than a year in the saddle before deciding that the life of a cowboy wasn't for them. Indeed, even those who stuck around typically only did so for 6 or 7 years before finding some other occupation or starting up their own ranch with what money they had managed to save up over the years. As for Harry, he would apparently roam about working as a cowboy before eventually returning back to Cortez, Colorado and his family for a time. Meanwhile, back before Harry Langebaugh first left his cousin's ranch, just about 75 miles away in Telluride, Colorado, Bob Parker, the future Butch Cassidy, was looking for work after leaving the shelter of home in the Mormon country for the first time. Now, Telluride at the time was a booming mining town, thanks to the sizable gold and silver deposits that had been found in the area. As such, the town was replete with ways to separate anyone who had made money taking the valuable ores out of the earth from said earnings. Saloons, dance halls, gambling dens, and brothels all offered opportunities for miners to spend their money, while plenty of criminals also lurked waiting to scam or even straight up rob the unsuspecting. All of which was likely quite the culture shock for the young men who had grown up pretty much sheltered in Mormon country. Fairly quickly upon arriving, Bob Parker, the future Butch Cassidy, got a job hauling ore by mule train down the mountain. This was hard work, but at the very least it paid well. Indeed, Bob even made a point to send some of his earnings back home to his family, while the rest was often spent in one of the local saloons carousing with his co-workers. All in all, then, things in general seemed to be going fine, until, come the spring of 1885, Bob went to retrieve and start breaking the fine young colt that he had boarded at a local ranch. Now, Bob's sister Lula alleges that the rancher in question coveted the fine young horse and wanted to buy it off her brother. Bob, however, had no interest in parting with the colt and instead rode off with it. That all being said, it's also been suggested that perhaps this isn't the whole story. Instead, it's possible that Bob might have owed the rancher money for taking care of his horse and had failed to pay him. Regardless, the rancher quickly filed a complaint with the law against Bob Parker, claiming that the horse was his. Indeed, this rancher even had neighbors attest to having seen the colt in question grazing in his fields for some time. For this, Bob Parker, the future infamous outlaw Butch Cassidy, would be arrested and held in jail. From all accounts, however, he was not mistreated during his imprisonment. Indeed, when his father Max, after being alerted to the situation, came to check on Bob, he was surprised upon arriving to find that his son's cell door was wide open, while his boy was just laying inside on the bed reading. When Max asked his son about this unusual setup, Bob responded that the authorities felt no need to actually lock him up, as they were confident he would not escape, because they knew full well he hadn't, quote, taken anything that wasn't mine. A confidence that seemed to be well placed, as he would win his case and be set free as a result. From here, rumor has it Bob might have wandered up to Wyoming for a time. If true, he likely found work helping large ranchers move their herds northward in response to the drought conditions in the region. By 1987, though, Bob would be back in Telluride, finding a town that was larger and even more prosperous than the one he had left. During this stay, young Bob would meet another Mormon lad round about his age who was going by the name Matt Warder, but whose real name was Willard Christensen. Now, the reason why Willard was going by Matt Warder was likely the same reason why he had left Utah behind. You see, Matt had apparently gotten into a fight with another young man over a girl, a brawl which ended with Matt being on top, but in doing so, he feared he might have killed his rival. So the young man got out of there and started going by a different name. After fleeing his hometown, Matt hooked up with some horse rustlers, and by the time he met up with young Bob Parker, Matt had struck upon a better way to make money on horses, and that was by racing them. Horse racing being a popular pastime all across the West at the time, something which certainly held true for Colorado. Now, when I say horse racing, you're likely picturing horse racing as we know it today with racetracks and the Kentucky Derby. That, however, is not what we're talking about here. Instead, these seem to have been more akin to drag races in that they took place in a straight line over a quarter or half mile. Contests in which hundreds might attend and thousands of dollars could be wagered. Contest in which Matt was confident that his mare could beat any horse around. Matt then was traveling around to the various towns, villages, cities, and other communities in the region to pit his horse against the local favorites. Now, apparently upon first meeting, while the two Utah boys hit it off, Bob wasn't exactly sold on the prospect of Matt's horse winning. Instead, he warned his new companion that he was familiar with the colt he was going to race and how fast it was. Matt, for his part, though, remained confident, and the two men reportedly bet each other their horse, saddle, spurs, etc. on the outcome of the race. Yet, despite being on different sides of a wager concerning the outcome, Matt still asked if Bob would act as a judge for the race, saying that he trusted him as a fellow Utah cowboy to call it fairly, which he apparently did as Matt's mare won. Yet when Bob went to pay off his debt, Matt refused, and instead offered his fellow Utah cowboy a partnership in his racing operation. An offer which Bob Parker, the future Butch Cassidy, apparently could not refuse. So the pair started traveling around, with Bob taking upon the responsibility of being the horse's rider during the races. The pair then were soon joined by yet another young man named Tom McCarty, who, despite coming from a well-to-do family, had a history as a rustler and just general outlaw behavior. Matt Mortar, however, knew McCarty well, as Tom had married Matt's older sister, although she had apparently died at some point subsequently. The three men then apparently made a pretty penny racing their unbeatable horse here, there, and everywhere around Colorado, beating local favorites one after another. There was, however, just one problem with this setup. That being, eventually word about their incredibly fast horse got around, and people simply stopped betting against it, meaning that eventually their horse racing days had to come to an end, and they then had to find work, as they hadn't exactly been saving the money they were winning from their races. In fact, it seems they were spending it about as quickly as they got it by eating fine foods, getting drunk, and indulging in any other forms of vice or entertainment that took their fancy. With their racing days done, both Bob and Matt got work as cowboys on a ranch about 40 miles outside of Telluride. Tom McCarty, on the other hand, had no interest in such work, and just kind of went and hung out in his isolated cabin to figure out what he wanted to do next. It wasn't long, however, before both Bob Parker and Matt Mortar, who despite being quite capable, grew bored of the monotonous life of a cowboy and ranch hand. So, come the winter of 1889, the two young men approached the ranch owner to inform him they were leaving. The ranch owner was sad to see the two go, as he considered them both excellent workers, and so in addition to their final wages, he also gave them a recently broken horse as a reward for all their hard work. After leaving the ranch, instead of running back home to Utah as he had told the ranch owner they intended to do, the two young men headed for Tom McCarty's cabin, where they joined him in trying to figure out what it was they were going to do now. A cabin which notably was less than half a mile from the Long and Bow family ranch, where the future Sundance Kid was living and working around this time, making it possible that the future Butch Cassidy and future Sundance Kid might have met in some form or fashion around this time, even though their known partnership was still years away. As for the three men now hanging out at Tom McCarty's, their problem was simple. They needed money, but their prospects weren't exactly great. They couldn't go back to horse racing as no one wanted to take on their horse, and life as a cowboy was hard and tedious. Eventually, Tom McCarty's thoughts reportedly shifted to a different way they might get some quick cash. They could rob a bank, the Telluride San Miguel Valley Bank to be precise, a bank which was owned by local businessman and lawyer Lucien L. Nunn, something that was fairly common for the banks operating in these western towns, as more often than not, these financial institutions were owned and operated by some rich merchant in town who had earned and cultivated a reputation for being trustworthy, so the locals would have faith in putting their money into his care. In addition to building up the trust of the local populace by dealing fairly with them, these businessmen also typically had to portray an air of wealth, which oftentimes meant wearing the finest fashions as a way of showing that he knew what he was doing when it came to issues of money and wealth. Part of this whole show also involved constructing stately, well-furnished buildings with thick walls, as a way of announcing that this was a place of wealth, and where you could trust that your own money would be safe. Indeed, as further proof of their trustworthiness, banks typically kept their vaults open during the day so that locals could easily look inside and see that their money and or other valuables were still there. Now, what made the Telluride Bank in particular appealing to our three would-be robbers was the fact that the town as a whole was still riding high as it prospered off of a mining boom. The bank in particular then was benefiting. Plus, if they hit it at the right time, they could make off with the mine's payroll. Now, according to Matt Warner's recollection of events, Bob Parker, the future Butch Cassidy, was very much into this idea from the start. Indeed, he reportedly was the one who actually identified the Telluride Bank as a prime target. Tom McCarty, however, even though this was supposedly partially his idea, was still hesitant. You see, out of the various potential outlaw activities they could undertake, robbing a bank was one of the most dangerous, and the Telluride Bank in particular was an especially dangerous target. After all, basically every able-bodied man in Telluride not only owned a gun, but they also carried it on them at all times, meaning that there would be quite a lot of men who had the means to take aim and shoot at them as word spread that the bank had been robbed. Many would also likely have the motivation to shoot them since by definition, they would essentially be running off with at least some of their money if they were stealing the mine's payroll. Matt Warner's apparent response to all of this, however, was that from what he heard, cowboys were robbing banks across the West all the time, meaning it can't be that hard. Which was apparently enough logic for all three men to agree they were going to rob the San Miguel Valley Bank in Telluride. Yet before actually robbing the bank, they first had to figure out when would be the best time to hit it, meaning they had to figure out on what day the bank was going to contain the payroll for the mine. This is where Bob Parker, the future Butch Cassidy, came in. Depending upon the account, he was either already familiar with the bank's workings, or he was the one sent to go spend time in town observing the bank so that he and his companions would know when the money arrived. Regardless of how exactly they came by the knowledge of when the mine's payroll would be there, the three would-be bank robbers rode into town on the 22nd of June, 1889. Which was a Saturday, so they spent that day and the next reportedly drinking, gambling, and whatnot, looking for all appearances like some cowboys who had recently returned from the trail and were looking to spend their earnings, something that was a regular sight in many a western town in those days. Monday then looked at first glance to be much of the same, as Matt Warner, Tom McCarty, Bob Parker, the future Butch Cassidy, and a fourth unidentified man spent their morning hanging out in one of the three saloons that were located near the bank. Then around noon, when there was only a single teller left to watch over the bank, the four men made their move. One would be left holding the reins of their four horses, while two took up positions on the sidewalk outside the bank, while the fourth and final member of their team entered the bank by himself. This man then walked up to the lone clerk left inside and handed him a check. For the clerk then, everything seemed to be business as usual, until when he bent over to examine the check, he was seized by the back of his neck. The clerk's face was then shoved forcefully down onto the desk, as the man warned him to keep quiet on the, quote, pain of instant death. It was at this point that the robber summoned his two compatriots who had been waiting on the sidewalk outside the bank. These two men then, as the teller was held down firmly in place, gathered up all the greenbacks and gold that was in the bank, a believed $20,750 all told. Then, as quickly as they arrived, the three men left the bank, retrieving their horses from the fourth man. The bank robbers mounted up and, according to accounts, fired their revolvers as a kind of warning to the bystanders, who were themselves surprised and paralyzed by what was taking place, at which point the outlaws took off, riding out of town with all haste. They rode their horses fast and hard, and were reportedly aided in their attempts to outdistance any pursuit by the fact that they had set up a relay of fresh mounts beforehand, meaning that at predetermined locations along their escape route, they had fresh horses that they could switch to and continue riding at top speed. All in all, this seems to have been a really good plan that they executed without flaw. They were in and out quickly. As such, no one in town seemed to be able to identify who any of the men involved in the robbery were. Meaning it's quite likely the four men, once they had completely eluded any pursuit, could have just slipped back into the general population and no one would have been any the wiser. Or that would have been the case had it not been for a twist of fate that none of them could have seen coming. You see, as the four men were riding away from Telluride with their ill-gotten wealth, well ahead of anyone even thinking of pursuing them, they just happened to ride past a man riding in the opposite direction. Now, this wouldn't have been a big deal had this man not been the very same man who owned the ranch that Bob Parker, the future Butch Cassidy, and his friend Matt Warner had just recently worked for. A man who most definitely remembered the two young cowboys who had done such a good job working for him before ultimately quitting as they informed him they were heading back home to Utah. As such, he couldn't help but take note of the two boys when they rode past him in Colorado and wonder why they had not gone home like they said they intended to. It was with this lingering thought in mind that upon arriving in Telluride, the ranch owner learned that the bank had just been robbed by four men riding out in the direction he had just come from, at which point he started putting two and two together. It was then with this bit of unfortunate luck that the authorities now had the names of two of the suspected bank robbers. This then was a changing point for the two identified men, as up until this moment, Matt Warner would characterize Bob and himself as half outlaws, by which he seemed to mean they could still go back to living a normal life should they so choose, and not really have to fear being hunted down by the law. Now though, according to Matt, they, quote, became real outlaws, burned our bridges behind us, and had no way to live except by robbing and stealing. With that being said, some speculate that this was not the group's first bank robbery. A bit before the Telluride heist, a bank in Denver had been robbed by a well-dressed man. This man had been participating in a private meeting in the bank president's private office when he pulled out a gun and a bottle of a clear liquid, which he claimed was enough nitroglycerin to blow the whole bank up sky high. Naturally terrified, the bank president followed the dangerous man's instructions and handed over $21,000, which according to legend contained a $1,000 bill that he slipped in hoping that if the robber went to spend it, he would be caught. Regardless of if that is true or not, as the man with the nitro departed the bank, he appeared to hand his loot over to another man who had been standing by the door before they both headed off in opposite directions. Some then believe that Bob Parker, the future Butch Cassidy, and his friend Matt Warner had been involved in this crime. Warner, however, never made mention of this particular crime in his memoir, but his daughter would later claim that her father and Bob had admitted to her that they had been the ones responsible for the Denver robbery. Yet regardless of whether or not the two were involved in the Denver theft, the most important thing was they had most definitely robbed the bank in Telluride and had been identified in doing so. Bob Parker then was now a full-fledged outlaw. During the time when Bob Parker was taking part in horse races and starting down the road toward his life as an outlaw, Harry Longabout, the future Sundance Kid, was traveling the countryside pursuing work as a cowboy. Work that from all accounts he was quite skilled at, as he had a good reputation for wrangling and breaking horses. A reputation that likely helped him to get work with the Homeland and Cattle Company that was more commonly referred to as the N-Bar-N, due to their brand consisting of an N-N, which was itself a reference to the company's owners, brothers William and Frederick Niedringhaus, who operated a number of ranches from Saskatchewan, Canada to Clayton, New Mexico. Now, the main reason why Harry found work with the N-Bar-N at the time was because they needed help in driving some 17,000 cattle from Perico Creek in New Mexico up to the Little Dry Creek in Montana, a task that likely took anywhere from 4 to 6 months depending upon the type of weather and various other difficulties the cowboys and their herd encountered along the way, as driving cattle along the trail seems to have been a mixture of monotony and boredom intermixed with moments of extreme danger. Day after day for weeks and months on end, they would continue to drive the cattle along vast stretches of flat open plains. during which time, however, they had to worry about the various natural predators roaming those plains, bandits, and even bands of hostile Native Americans who, for some reason, took exception to these strangers invading and taking over their lands. That being said, the greatest danger the cowboys seemed to face wasn't so much violence directed at them, but instead the result of accidents and bad luck. Most cowboys who died on the trail perished as a result of riding accidents or getting struck by lightning while out riding on the open plains. The cattle who they were driving and protecting were also a source of at least occasional danger as well. River crossings, for example, were especially dangerous as cattle had a tendency to panic during them. Indeed, it was said to not take much to panic the cattle and send thousands of them stampeding dangerously across the plains, a tendency that was especially hazardous if they did that at night after being alarmed by something as harmless as a match being struck. As for Harry Longabout, he would obviously survive this ride, and at the end of it, he would find work at the End Bar End Ranch up in Montana at the end of the trail. Unfortunately, his timing would prove to be exceptionally poor. You see, conditions already weren't great, as the summer of that year, 1886, had been both very hot and very dry. These drought conditions weakened the livestock, leading a number of ranchers to dump an abnormally large number of cattle on the market as they could not feed them. This glut of cattle on the market naturally caused prices to drop dramatically, which led to ranchers firing a number of their cowboys, including Harry Longabout. The hard times, however, were just beginning, as the winter of 1886 to 87 was one that the people who lived through it would never forget. Things really seemed to kick off when on the 16th of November, frigid winds brought not just heavy snows to Wyoming and Montana, but also temperatures of 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. This, however, was just the beginning, as within 3 weeks another blizzard would strike the region. The winter was far from over, however, as a month later on the 9th of January, a third major blizzard struck the region. Temperatures fell to 68 degrees below 0 at times, while the snow fell at a rate of an inch an hour. Snowfall that just never seemed to end, because it seemed as if every time the skies were about to clear and the snow was about to let up, the clouds would just thicken again as the heavy snow resumed. Even then, winter still had more in store, as just 2 weeks later, on the 15th of January, temperatures dropped to 46 degrees below 0. Then, just about 2 weeks after that, on the 28th of January, the snow returned, this time falling for 72 hours straight. No one in the region had ever seen a winter with such brutally cold temperatures and with such massive snowfalls. In some areas, ranch houses, barns, and outbuildings were actually buried by the snowfall, while the grasslands themselves were all but destroyed by the brutal winter, which was especially bad news for the cattle and for anyone whose livelihood depended upon them. You see, at this time, the western ranchers didn't bring their cattle in for wintertime. They never bothered building structures so they would have places where the cows could be brought to be sheltered from the freezing cold and the snow. In fact, they didn't even attempt to make sure that the cattle stayed close enough so that the cowboys could bring them hay to eat during the winter months. Instead, for the most part, ranchers just left their herd to fend for themselves on the open range, figuring they would be fine and that even in snow conditions, the cattle would be able to dig up enough grass to survive until the spring. Now, as you might expect, this way of doing things during a normal winter invariably resulted in the loss of a number of cattle, losses that they expected and found acceptable. The losses from this winter, however, were anything but. Come spring, once the snows had finally melted come the end of February, the open range where the cattle had been allowed to roam and fend for themselves would be littered with the bodies of tens of thousands of dead and dying cattle. A scene that I doubt any of us can truly imagine the full horror of, much less the smell that came from so many dead and decaying bodies. This winter then came to be known as the Big Die-Up, for obvious reasons, as it's estimated that 90% of the cattle who had been left to fend for themselves on the range in Wyoming and Montana had died. For the End Bar End Ranch in particular, they are believed to have lost about 40,000 cattle in all, which represented about 75% of their herd. A situation that resulted in many of the cowboys who had remained employed after the drought conditions of the previous year to be laid off as well, meaning that there were suddenly an awful lot of out-of-work and desperate young men in that part of the country. As for the future Sundance Kid Harry Longabout, he had spent the winter off in the Black Hills of South Dakota, doing what work he could find just to try to afford food and shelter, noting any letter from that time, quote, I have always worked for an honest living, was employed last summer by one of the best outfits in Montana, and don't think they can say aught against me. But having got discharged last winter, I went to the Black Hills to seek employment, which I could not get, and was forced to work for my board a month and a half rather than to beg or steal. Finding no work in the Black Hills, Harry set off for the N-Bar Inn, hoping to sign on with that outfit again. His path, though, would take him through the holdings of Western Ranches Incorporated, an outfit more commonly known as the 3V Ranch, due to its brand consisting of, you guessed it, 3 Vs. Now, the 3V Ranch was owned by a group of English investors, but it was run by one John Clay, who was also a member of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association and the Cheyenne Club, a group consisting of wealthy cattle barons, all of whom had been hit hard by the devastating winter. Clay then was already in a bad mood that year, and he was also known to have a special distaste for cowboys like Harry Longabaugh, who had a habit of riding the range going from job to job, rather than settling down in one place, likely because those cowboys were looking for better opportunities, and thus demanded more money than those who were content to just settle in one place and accept what men like Clay were willing to pay them. Harry then was likely not a welcome figure as he rode through the 3 V's lands. It was during this time then that he apparently, for whatever reason, likely desperation, stole a saddle, a bridle, a revolver, and a gray horse that had a J branded on the left shoulder, all of which belonged to the employees of the 3V Ranch. A theft that particularly outraged John Clay, who detested the wandering cowboy types like the, quote, smooth-faced, gray-eyed boy, who had been identified as the primary suspect. A description that very much fit the 20-year-old, 5'10", light-haired, light-complexioned Harry Longabaugh, down to his eyes, which were described as being blue or gray in color. After his own men failed to find the man responsible for the theft, Clay reported the crime to Crook County Sheriff Jim Ryan, whose headquarters were in the town of Sundance, Wyoming. As he did so, Clay made it clear that he expected the lawman to ride down the thief with all haste. The sheriff, as it turned out, though, really didn't have to do all that much, as a horse with a J on its shoulder and a young man fitting the description had been located and locked up in Miles City some 300 miles away. For Harry Longabaugh, the future Sundance Kid, this was wholly outside of his experience. He had never been arrested or even had his freedom restrained in such a way. He had, after all, been living for years on his own, riding about wherever he wished. Yet now he found himself locked away in a cell. Sheriff Jim Ryan then headed out to Miles City, where after filling out the paperwork transferring the outlaw into his custody, he took the shackled Harry Longabaugh out of his cell, and together the two men boarded a Northern Pacific train. Yet instead of taking the young man directly back to Sundance, Wyoming, some 300 miles away, Sheriff Ryan, for some unknown reason, took him on a train that was bound for St. Paul, Minnesota, a destination some 700 miles away, from where they would travel back to Sundance by stagecoach, a trip that in all would likely cover some 2,000 miles. Why the sheriff chose this route no one knows. Now you can assume he had some purpose for heading to St. Paul, yet what that might be has never been explained, much less why he chose to try and take care of that business with a prisoner in tow. Regardless of the sheriff's reasons, Harry Longabaugh would never actually reach St. Paul. You see, while Sheriff Jim Ryan was using the train's bathroom as they traveled down the track somewhere near Duluth, Minnesota, Harry managed to pick the locks on the shackles and handcuffs, at which point the now free and unwatched young man jumped off the moving train and ran off. Meanwhile, when Sheriff Ryan returned and found his prisoner escaped, he ordered the train stopped and began conducting a search of the area. However, they failed to locate the escaped thief, and with the train having a schedule to keep, they were forced to depart. The now embarrassed Sheriff Ryan, upon his eventual return to Sundance, would have a $250 reward put out for the capture of Harry Longabaugh. As it turns out, though, Sheriff Ryan wasn't the only, let's say, less than intelligent individual in this story. You see, for some reason, Harry, rather than running to someplace far away where he would not be instantly known, instead returned to the region around Miles City, the exact same place where he had been arrested. As such, especially with his escape from custody being such big news, he was identified and arrested again on the 6th of June at the N-Bar N Ranch, a place where he was very much known. Now, once he had been captured by a pair of local lawmen, since it was fairly late already, they opted to shackle Harry to the wall of a shack on the N-Bar N Ranch that was located on the stagecoach route. The plan was they would stay there for the night and await the arrival of the next coach the following morning. a delay which seemed to give the young, inexperienced outlaw ideas of making an escape similar to the one he had made the last time he had been captured by the law and had his transfer to more secure holdings delayed. Unfortunately for Harry, though, his reputation preceded him, as Deputy Sheriff F. Davis seemed to be ready for his tricks. According to a write-up of this incident by the Yellowstone Daily Journal, quote, "After Mr. Davis made the arrest, he took 3 six-shooters from the bold young criminal and shackled him and handcuffed him with some patent lock bracelets which were warranted to hold anything until unlocked by the key, and which the manufacturers offered a premium if they could be opened otherwise." With their prisoner now locked in these supposedly unpickable cuffs, Davis and his partner for this arrest, a stock inspector on the ranch, both laid down in opposite corners of the room so that their prisoner was chained to the wall between them. Yet even with such precautions, quote, "Davis played possum, keeping an eye on the prisoner. Soon as he thought everyone was asleep, the kid, shackled and manacled as he was, managed to free himself and, rising stealthily, approached a window and raised it, and was about to make a break for liberty, when sly old F thought it was time for him to take a hand, and, rising on his elbow with a cocked six-shooter in his hand, he said in a quiet tone of voice, 'Kid, you're loose, ain't you?' Defeated, Harry backed away from the window as the deputy sheriff rousted his partner. The 2 lawmen then chained Harry up again, and this time made sure that one of them was awake for the rest of the night, ensuring that their prisoner had no further opportunities to attempt to escape. Then, upon arriving back in town, they locked him in jail, and promptly telegraphed Sheriff Ryan, letting him know they had caught his man again. Meanwhile, the Yellowstone Daily Journal was busy touting this capture, as it declared that Harry, who had only stolen a horse, a saddle, and a revolver before escaping from an inept sheriff, was not only comparable to the infamous James boys, but also had, quote, "all the necessary accomplishments to outshine them all." An insane exaggeration, but one that was seemingly the result of similar behavior to what we saw with Billy the Kid. In that newspapers and lawmen were eager to attribute any and all crimes that happened in a given area to a specific criminal, especially if that criminal had garnered enough notoriety, which Harry had apparently done through his escape from the train. A trend which makes figuring out the activities and movements of outlaws like Butch and Sundance difficult, as over the years any number of crimes that they were not actually involved in would get attributed to them because they were famous. Regardless of the Yellowstone Daily Journal's exaggerated reporting, Sheriff Ryan would arrive in Miles City on the 19th of June to take Harry into custody so he could escort him back to Sundance, Wyoming, this time without a bizarre detour to St. Paul. Harry, as it turns out, however, wouldn't be content to just wait for his trial, as he clearly continued to try and escape from jail, but was prevented from doing so when it was noted that one of the bolts in his cell door was missing. Prevented from escaping again, Harry Longabaugh would be charged with 3 counts of grand larceny, charges which he initially pled not guilty to until being convinced by his court-appointed attorney to plead guilty to the horse theft in exchange for the other indictments being dropped. For this crime, Harry would be sentenced to 18 months of hard labor in a newly built jail right there in Sundance. Harry, though, still wasn't done trying to escape, as on the 1st of May 1888, he and another prisoner managed to get out of their cell and jump a guard. This attempt, however, didn't go quite the way they planned, as while another prisoner managed to escape in the chaos before ultimately being recaptured, Harry himself, who the papers had started referring to as the Kid, wouldn't even get that far. You see, the guard who the Kid attempted to assault simply managed to overpower the prisoner and return him to his cell in the Sundance jail. Yet the longer he was in jail and the closer the end of his sentence came, the less sense it made for Harry, aka the Kid, to try and escape. As such, as his sentence was coming to an end, the Crook County prosecutor wrote to Wyoming's governor requesting a pardon for Harry Longabaugh so that the, quote, "boy may be restored to his civil rights," a request that was supported by the sheriff. As a result, on the 4th of February 1889, one day before his scheduled release, the young man who had come to be known as the Kid was granted a full pardon by the governor, who noted, quote, "he is under 21 years of age, and his behavior has been good since confinement, showing an earnest desire to reform. Therefore, I do hereby grant Harry Longabaugh a full and complete pardon." Now officially free, Harry would leave the town of Sundance behind, although he would carry its name with him for the rest of his days. Harry now headed for Deadwood, the closest town that offered all the kinds of distractions that a 21-year-old who had just been locked away for a year and a half could want. The Kid, though, would have another brush with the law a few months after this. At the time, Harry was staying about 35 miles north of Sundance when one day a sheriff and his deputy appeared looking to arrest one of the 3 men Harry was staying with, Buck Hanby, who was wanted for murder. When Buck was ordered to surrender, however, he apparently reached for his gun, and the deputy responded by shooting Buck dead right then and there. Understandably, this was quite the shock for the other men, who had not woken up that day expecting to see a man gunned down right before their eyes. Now, none of them wanted to end up like Buck, however, so they all kept their hands clearly up in the air. Harry, though, was apparently so upset by what he had witnessed that he vocalized some sort of threat toward the deputy. Now, nothing would happen in that moment, but the deputy, upon returning to town, swore out a warrant against the man who had threatened him. Harry, however, had no interest in returning to jail, so by the time the warrant was issued for his arrest, he had already left the territory behind. Now, where exactly Harry went to at this point is unclear. Some, though, want to place Harry's next appearance in the historical record in Telluride as the 4th man who had participated in the Telluride bank robbery, but there doesn't really seem to be much evidence supporting this. Instead, it seems like Harry might have tried to pursue a lawful life for a while, which does make some sense. After all, he had just spent some time in jail and had just witnessed a man gunned down right before his eyes for alleged criminal misdeeds. Events that might have been enough to scare the young man straight for a time. Indeed, Harry seems to have during this period ended up in Alberta, Canada, breaking broncos and earning a good reputation among his fellow ranch hands for being likable, charming, well-behaved, and a good rider. From this work, Harry seems to have saved up enough money to purchase a share in a saloon at the Grand Hotel in Calgary with a partner named Frank Hamilton. Their relationship, however, would soon go south, potentially due to a horse that one of the 2 men had bought from the other. Whatever the issue exactly was, we don't know, but apparently Hamilton had a reputation for being a hothead and a history of driving off his business partners. The situation, whatever it was, apparently resolved itself when Harry pulled a gun on Hamilton. Now, he would not actually shoot the other man, but he would, before departing, make sure to take from the saloon's till what he believed he was owed by Hamilton. It was at this point that Harry left Canada behind and ended up back in Montana, specifically Malta, a locale frequented by cowboys who were out of work for the winter, as only those cowboys who settled down long-term in one place were rewarded with steady work through the lean winter months. All the other cowboys then had to scrap and fight over the few remaining jobs or find other means of supporting themselves. As for Malta in particular, it was a place to while away the winter months, drinking, gambling, and pursuing young women, a pastime that Harry was apparently quite good at, as with his blonde hair, blue eyes, and mustache, he was considered to be quite handsome, a perception that was only enhanced by his preference for wearing the most stylish clothes of the day. It was during this winter that Harry linked up with one Bill Madden, who may or may not have been the 4th man involved in the Telluride bank heist. Regardless of his involvement in said robbery, Bill at the very least was not adverse to the idea of being an outlaw, as rather than continue to struggle finding work to see them through the winter, the 2 cowboys began cooking up a plan to rob a train. Now, this may sound like a very ambitious plan, but in comparison to Bob Parker aka Butch Cassidy's first full foray into being an outlaw, this was actually more reasonable. As where if you robbed a bank, you were in the middle of town and were then generally liable to find yourself in a situation where you were dealing with a town full of pissed off and armed people, seeing as how typically all the money in small town banks actually belonged to the people living there. Trains, on the other hand, were more likely to be carrying money belonging to larger corporate concerns, and they more often than not didn't really have anything resembling reliable security, which made them a less risky target to rob. Plus, there was the fact that by their very nature, trains ran on a reliable schedule, which helped to make planning a train robbery easier. Trains then were robbed not infrequently, and those conducting such thefts were almost never caught while doing so. Train robberies, you see, by their very nature were hard on law enforcement, as opposed to a bank robbery that happened in town where news would spread quickly and so pursuit could be organized fairly rapidly. When it came to train robberies, the law would not learn about them until well after they happened. You see, trains weren't robbed while they were stopped in town at a station. Instead, trains were stopped and robbed while they were en route. Therefore, the law would not learn about a robbery until the train arrived at its next stop, at which point to even begin pursuit of the outlaws, the lawmen had to ride out of town to where the robbery had happened to begin picking up the criminal's trail. Then, further frustrating attempts to track down these outlaws, the lawmen had to deal with the fact that many local citizens didn't see a problem with robbing trains and the big corporations using them to haul the money and valuables that were stolen. As such, some locals wouldn't bother aiding the pursuit of such criminals, and some would even actively aid in their escape. Then, even if the lawmen managed to capture the outlaws, if they had sufficient support among the local population, it would be hard for the lawmen to get a conviction, providing their only victim was some big corporation that the locals didn't like anyway. Meanwhile, even though the process of robbing a train may sound daunting, it actually wasn't all that difficult. The primary thing they had to do, and likely the hardest part of the job, was stopping the train, but there were multiple proven ways of doing that. Outlaws might block the rail line using logs, boulders, or even something that had been set on fire. They could also board the train and get into the engine compartment to force the engineer to stop it, or they could just wait for the train to stop of its own volition at some remote isolated water tank. In comparison to getting the train to stop, getting into the so-called express cars, where the most valuable cargo was carried, was fairly easy, as security typically wasn't great. Sure, the doors to the express cars could be locked, but for years it was a simple matter to drill the locks to gain admittance. Meanwhile, even though the safes inside were in comparison a bit of a tougher nut to crack, a bit of dynamite usually solved that problem. As for the men charged with acting as guards for the valuables in these cars, they weren't exactly well compensated. Indeed, for an extended period of time, these men weren't even issued weapons by the companies, but expected to provide their own. In other words, it's not like they exactly had the greatest motivation to put their lives on the line. Now, once they had decided they were going to try and rob a train, Harry Longabout, the Sundance Kid, Bill Madden, who he knew from Cortez, Colorado, and a third out-of-work cowboy named Harry Bass set their sights on the Great Northern Number 23, a passenger train that ran from St. Paul, Minnesota to Butte, Montana. Two of the three bandits then planned to board the train in the cattle shipping depot of Monta, Montana, that lay some 50 miles south of the Canadian border, which they did when the train arrived at 3 in the morning on the 29th of November for its regular mail and water stop. Then, once the train set off, the two masked men made their way to the engine compartment, where they ordered the engineer to stop the train at the bonfire that was built alongside the tracks about a mile west of town by their companion, who was waiting there for them with their horses. Once the train was stopped, the third bandit then held the engineer and fireman at gunpoint, while the others set off for the express car where the valuables would be held. Along the way, they would encounter the train's conductor and brakeman, who had understandably been curious as to why the train had made this unexpected stop. As such, they were heading for the engine to figure out what was happening when they encountered the two armed and masked men. The conductor and brakeman were then led at gunpoint to the mail car, where the conductor was forced to tell the mail clerk to open the car door. Which he did, but unfortunately for the bandits, nothing of particular value was found inside. So they moved on to the express car, where the conductor was again ordered to instruct the messenger inside to open up. While the messenger would open the door, when he was told to open the larger of the two safes inside, the one containing the most valuable items, the messenger insisted he did not know the combination. Instead, the combination had been sent on to the destination so it could be opened there, so as to prevent theft en route. Which was inconvenient, as these bandits apparently had no explosives with them to remedy the situation, and so they had to be satisfied with the contents of the car's second smaller safe that the messenger did have the combination for. However, as it turned out, this safe only contained a pair of checks, some packages, and less than $20 in cash. Disappointed, the bandits tried again to order the messenger to open the larger safe, threatening to kill him if he refused this time. To which the messenger managed to reply, clearly frightened, quote, "Very well then, I suppose I've got to die." This response apparently caught the main bandit by surprise, and he seemingly had little choice but to believe him, as he could not fathom that the man would be willing to put his life on the line for a simple small paycheck. So, apparently not wanting to kill the innocent messenger, the robber reportedly nodded goodbye to the train's crew and signaled to his partners it was time to leave. The trio then rode off with their take, which was estimated to be a meager $70 based upon the cash and packages they had stolen. Now, reportedly, they could have gotten at least $2,000 in cash had they chosen to rob the passengers, but the bandits had no apparent interest in such a crime. All in all, then, this train robbery had gone about as poorly as possible. Indeed, as it turns out, had the trio really done their research, they would have realized that the train had left St. Paul on a Sunday, meaning that it had left on a day where the banks weren't open, and thus, by definition, wasn't going to be carrying any deposits, Plus, even worse, during the course of the robbery, the masked men had not done a great job ensuring that their bandanas kept their faces covered, so descriptions of the 3 train robbers quickly spread across the territory. Meanwhile, the express company was determined to send a message that they would not tolerate train robberies no matter how poorly executed they might have been. To that end, they offered a $500 reward for the arrest of each bandit, an amount that was for each of them 7 times the amount they had stolen, an offer that the governor of Montana promised to match, meaning that in all there was $3,000 in offer for the arrest of 3 men who had stolen a measly $70. As it turns out, though, the posse didn't have to look all that far, because at least 2, if not all 3 of the robbers had simply returned to Malta, where they had been found drinking in the same saloon they had been in before undertaking the robbery. Both Bill Madden and Harry Bass were thus picked up, and so too, according to some accounts at least, was Sundance/Harry. If he was picked up, though, he apparently gave them a fake name, and was subsequently released when Bill Madden opted to talk, naming his partners as Bass and Longbow, neither name matching the one Sundance had given the authorities. Which, if this is what happened, shows you just how easy it was to lie about one's identity at the time. That being said, it seems at least equally possible that Sundance was just never picked up. Regardless, Sundance would manage to slip away escaping the law, while both Bill Madden and Sam Bass were charged with, quote, burglary in the nighttime. Both men would plead guilty, with Madden receiving 8 years for confessing and giving up as co-conspirators, while Bass would be given 10 years for refusing to talk. So at this point, Bob Parker, the future Butch Cassidy, and Harry Longabout, better known as the Sundance Kid, due to his arrest, escapes, and various other escapades in Sundance, Wyoming, were now both on the outlaw trail, having both committed their first major robberies. As such, while this episode is coming to an end, their stories as outlaws are just beginning. Stories that will have to, for now, have to wait for another time. Thank you for listening to Distorted History. If you would like to help out, please rate and review the podcast and tell your friends if you think they'll be interested. If you're feeling especially generous and would like to help keep this podcast going, please consider visiting my Ko-fi page at ko-fi.com/distortedhistory and donating a few bucks. Anything you can give is greatly appreciated. I will be posting updates on future episodes and sources there in addition to posting them on Twitter as I usually do. With all that being said, once again, thank you for listening, and until next time.